Pack your bags, ma'am. HOA orders say you're out by Friday. The man's voice ripped through the quiet morning like a thunderclap. I froze at the doorway, holding a cup of coffee that trembled so violently I thought it might slip from my hand. The man stood on my porch wearing a reflective vest and a smug expression, hammering an eviction notice right into the cedar frame of my front door. Each strike of the nail felt like a heartbeat. Loud, final, invasive. Behind him, a black SUV idled by the curb, and leaning casually against it, arms crossed, was Rick Callahan, the HOA president I had barely met but already despised from reputation alone. He was smirking, as if he'd just won a battle I didn't even know I was fighting. I stepped forward, my voice shaking. "Excuse me, what is this? I own this home. You can't just post that here." The man didn't look at me. He tore off the top copy, slapped it into my hand, and muttered, "Violation of Section 12, Article B, repeated noncompliance. Orders from the board, ma'am." Rick's grin widened. "Guess you should have read the bylaws before you planted that tree in your front yard, Sarah." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? We've lived here for 6 years. We never even joined an HOA." Rick chuckled under his breath, like it was all a joke meant to humiliate me. "Every property here falls under the association. You're no exception. And since you've ignored our notices, the board's voted to evict." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, except for the hammering sound still echoing in my ear. Curtains shifted across the street, neighbors watching, whispering behind glass. My humiliation burned like fire. I felt exposed, violated, small. Michael came rushing out barefoot, his voice full of disbelief. "What the hell's going on here?" Rick turned to him with mock politeness. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. Your wife here's in violation of landscaping standards. Multiple times. We've been patient, but she didn't comply. You have until Friday to vacate or we'll proceed with seizure." Michael snatched the paper from my shaking hand, scanning it with narrowed eyes. "You people are insane. This house is paid off. We don't owe anyone a cent." Rick shrugged, turning to his men. "Post the rest on the fence line. Make it official." I lunged forward, tearing one notice off the post before they could finish. "You can't do this," I shouted. Rick leaned close, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "Watch me." Then he turned, smirk intact, and climbed into his SUV. The men followed, leaving a trail of dust and the sound of cruel laughter echoing down the street. When they were gone, the silence hit harder than the confrontation. My hands trembled as I unfolded the wrinkled paper again. At the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Final notice of seizure. Failure to comply will result in forced removal." I stood frozen on my porch, staring at the words until they blurred through tears. None of it made sense. How could anyone evict us from land we rightfully owned? My father's voice echoed in my memory, low and firm. "Always protect what carries your name." Something deep inside me shifted, from fear to fury. I looked out across the street, past the rows of perfect lawns and trimmed hedges, and I knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just a notice. It was a declaration of war. "They can't evict me," I whispered, gripping the notice so tightly the paper tore in my hands. "Not when this land used to belong to my family. Ma'am, if what you're saying is true, this entire HOA might be operating illegally." The words came from a woman behind a plexiglass window at the county records office, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. That morning, I'd driven downtown with my hands locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, coffee untouched in the cup holder. The eviction notice sat on the passenger seat, fluttering with every gust from the air vent. I replayed yesterday's scene over and over. Rick's smirk, the hammer striking my doorframe, the neighbors whispering behind curtains. The humiliation still burned, but underneath it, something else had started to form. Resolve. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. In the one place Rick didn't control. The county records office smelled faintly of dust and ink. Rows of file drawers stretched down both sides, the kind of place where secrets hid behind manila folders. I approached the clerk's counter and explained the situation. An HOA trying to evict me from land I owned outright. At first, the clerk gave the polite, tired smile that government employees wear after years of hearing wild stories. But as soon as she typed my address into the database, that smile began to fade. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "Could you repeat your street name?" "Cypress Ridge Drive," I said. She nodded slowly, checking another system, cross-referencing parcel numbers. A frown formed. "That's strange." "What's strange?" I leaned in. "This map shows your lot outside of the HOA jurisdiction." I blinked. "What does that mean?" She turned the monitor slightly toward me. Two outlines appeared on the screen. One blue, one red. The red outline, labeled Cypress Ridge HOA, covered part of the subdivision. The blue line, labeled County Recorded Boundary, was smaller. My home, and at least a dozen others, fell outside that red area entirely. "So technically," I said slowly, "they don't have authority over my property." "Technically," she replied, lowering her voice, "no, they don't." The air between us thickened with silence. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. She kept glancing around, checking if anyone was watching. Then she said quietly, "Someone's been updating these maps without authorization. These files were modified last year. But not by our department." "You didn't hear that from me." A chill crawled down my spine. Someone inside the HOA had been manipulating official land records, changing legal boundaries to extend their power. "Can I get copies?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Copies, printouts, everything you can take," she said. "If what you're saying is true, you're going to need proof." I spent the next hour photocopying deed records, subdivision maps, and ownership filings, stacking papers until the clerk had to bring me a second folder. The rhythmic hum of the copier was the only sound in the small office, and with every new page, I felt my anger harden into something sharper: determination. Before leaving, I looked back at the clerk. "Thank you," I said sincerely. She nodded once, eyes darting toward a nearby door. "Be careful. If they've got someone altering files here, they're not playing fair." Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. I tucked the stack of documents under my arm and walked toward my car, scanning the lot out of habit. That's when I saw it. A black SUV idling across the street. Dark windows. Engine running. My chest tightened. I didn't need to see the driver to know. Rick Callahan. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The SUV didn't move as I pulled out, but my rearview mirror stayed filled with it for far too long. My pulse pounded the whole way home. 10 minutes later, I turned off the highway. The road grew darker as the sun dipped behind the hills. Every few seconds, headlights flared behind me. Bright, close, then fading. I sped up. The car followed. The neighborhood finally appeared, and I swung hard into my driveway, tires screeching. For a moment, the headlights halted at the end of the street. Then they blinked out. I sat there in the stillness, breathing hard, gripping the steering wheel. Whoever was in that car wanted me to know they were watching. And as I looked down at the county documents spread across the passenger seat, my proof, my leverage, I whispered to myself, if Rick's trying this hard to scare me, then I'm getting closer to something he doesn't want anyone to find. "You've got to be kidding me," I gasped, staring at my father's signature on the land Rick claimed to own. It was nearly midnight when I found myself sitting cross-legged in the middle of my living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. They were the last pieces of my father's life, documents I'd packed away years ago after his funeral and never had the strength to open again. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a memory I'd buried too deep. But now, after what I'd discovered at the county office, I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The first box was full of old construction, photos, neatly stacked and bound with rubber bands gone brittle with age. My father stood proudly in every shot. Flannel shirt, calloused hands, a clipboard in one arm and a blueprint in the other. Behind him, the outlines of houses still under construction stretched along a dirt road. My dirt road. Cypress Ridge Drive. I flipped through yellowed folders until one fell open across my lap. Inside were typewritten pages bearing the name Thompson Development Holdings, LLC. My breath caught. That was my father's company, the same one he ran until cancer took him 15 years ago. I remembered being a kid, sitting at his drafting table, tracing lines with my finger as he drew plans for homes he said would stand longer than any argument. I scanned further. Deed numbers, county stamps, surveyor signatures. And then at the bottom of one document, a familiar loop of cursive ink. John R. Thompson. My father's name. Clear as day. I read the title block again. Owner of record, Thompson Development Holdings. The parcel number matched the lot I was standing on. My heart thudded in my chest. This can't be, I whispered. I kept digging, opening folder after folder until the floor around me was a sea of paper. Each one was the same, deed after deed, all stamped and notarized, all tied to different parcels within Cypress Ridge. It wasn't just my home. It was the entire subdivision. Every cul-de-sac, every park, every so-called common area the HOA claimed to maintain. My father had built it all. He'd owned it all. But after his death, I remembered the company's assets going quiet. Some trust paperwork I'd never paid much attention to because I was too young to understand it. And that's when it clicked. The HOA must have stepped in after his passing, quietly assuming authority over land they had no right to. They didn't buy it. They didn't transfer it. They just took it, like squatters dressing up in legal titles. A wave of emotion hit me, grief, anger, disbelief, all tangled together. I could almost hear my father's voice, deep and steady in the back of my mind. Always protect what carries your name, Sarah. Paperwork lasts longer than promises. Tears blurred the ink as I held one of the deeds to my chest. I realized what the clerk had hinted at, what Rick had been so desperate to bury. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was illegitimate from the ground up. I remembered something from one of the legal videos I'd watched the night before, that developers can retain control rights and easements even after an HOA forms. If no transfer ever occurred, the control never legally changed hands. My father's company, through his trust, might still be the rightful owner, which meant that by blood, by inheritance, by law, so was I. The clock on the wall ticked louder. The air felt heavier, charged. I gathered the deeds carefully, placing them in a binder I hadn't touched in years. My hands shook as I locked it shut. Everything Rick had built his empire on, the fines, the threats, the authority, was sitting in my lap, written in my father's handwriting. As thunder rolled outside, I looked at the document one last time and felt the fire rise in my chest. Rick doesn't just control this neighborhood, I whispered, staring out the rain-streaked window. He's squatting on my father's land. Touch my fence again, and I'll call the sheriff. I screamed, but they kept painting red X's across my walls. The morning air reeked of fresh paint and arrogance. I stood barefoot on my porch, hair still damp from the shower, staring in disbelief as 3 men in neon vests marked my home like it was condemned property. Each stroke of that red spray paint slashed across my fence, my gate, my mailbox, like a scar. At the end of the driveway, Rick Callahan leaned against his golf cart, phone in hand, pretending to check messages. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but I could feel his smirk from across the yard. "Rick!" I shouted, storming toward him. "What is this supposed to be?" He didn't even look up. "Code violations," he said casually. "Section 8C, improper paint color on fence. Section 9B, unauthorized mailbox style. And those garden lights you installed? Non-compliant." I stared at him, furious. "You're insane. Those lights have been here for years." Rick finally raised his head, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe so, but you didn't have permission." Behind me, one of his men sprayed another giant X across my wooden gate. I snapped a photo with my phone, my hand trembling with anger. "I'm documenting this," I said. "Every bit of it." "Good," Rick said, stepping closer. "Make sure you also document the fines. $500 per day, starting now." "Fines?" I repeated, stunned. "For what? For living in my own home?" He shrugged. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Thompson. You should have thought about that before defying the HOA board." Something in his tone, that casual cruelty, hit me harder than the words. I felt the humiliation boiling inside me, the same fire that burned when they nailed the eviction notice to my door. This wasn't about grass height or mailbox colors. This was personal. Rick wanted submission, not compliance. "Your board has no authority over my property," I said sharply. "And you know it." Rick's smirk vanished for the first time, just for a second. Then it returned, colder. "You think you found something special in those county files? Good luck proving it." He turned to his men. "Mark the side walls too. I want every violation visible from the street." I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to scream. Instead, I stepped back, lifted my phone, and began filming everything. The workers, the paint, the license plates, even Rick's smug face. "Keep going," I said evenly. "Let's see how your illegal property damage looks in court." By the time they left, my once white fence looked like a crime scene. Red X's glared back at me under the noon sun. The smell of spray paint lingered long after the sound of their golf cart faded. That night, Michael and I attended the HOA's open meeting. The small community hall buzzed with neighbors, all whispering as we entered. Rick sat at the front table, tie loosened, posture relaxed, the king on his little throne. I stood up and played the footage from my phone for everyone to see. "This," I said, "is what your president authorized. Illegal vandalism, threats, and false fines." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Rick didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. A slow, deliberate laugh that made my stomach twist. "Mrs. Thompson," he said smoothly, "you can record all you want, but nothing you have changes the fact that you're in violation." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Neighbors shouted questions, some defended him, others looked horrified. But Rick just sat there, unbothered, enjoying the spectacle. When it finally ended, I gathered my things, shaking with anger. As I walked past him toward the door, he leaned close enough for me to smell the faint hint of his cologne and whispered, "You'll regret going against me, Sarah." I didn't reply. I just looked him dead in the eye and thought, not as much as you're going to regret underestimating me. These signatures don't match. Rick forged them all, Michael said, holding the papers under a lamp. The living room had turned into a war room. Papers were scattered across the dining table, overlapping like battle maps. Bylaws, meeting notes, scanned deeds, and printouts from the county records office. The only light came from the desk lamp Michael had pulled down low, casting sharp shadows across our faces. It was nearly 2 in the morning, but neither of us could stop. Every time we uncovered one inconsistency, another one appeared, like pulling threads from a web that refused to end. After Rick's stunt with the red paint, I knew I couldn't fight him emotionally. I had to fight him legally. So we started with the source, the HOA charter itself. I'd managed to get a copy of it from the county's public records, or what was supposed to be the official copy. But as Michael and I compared it to older homeowner packets that our neighbor Ellen had saved, small differences began to emerge. Page numbers didn't align. Clauses were rearranged. And then came the signatures. Michael held 2 versions side by side. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a name on both. Thomas H. Lee. One signed in 2008, one in 2015. Same title, different handwriting. I leaned closer. The loops, the spacing, everything about them was off. My pulse quickened. We found another mismatch, then another. Out of the 10 supposed founding members who'd signed the renewal of the HOA charter, at least 4 had handwriting that didn't match their old signatures. 2 of those people, Ellen told me, had already moved away years before the date on the document. It was forgery, plain and simple. Still, we needed confirmation. So the next morning, I scanned every page, labeled every file, and sent them to Attorney Jenkins, the real estate lawyer I'd contacted after discovering my father's deeds. Agreed to meet that afternoon. When we arrived, Jenkins sat behind his mahogany desk with reading glasses perched low on his nose. He examined each page in silence, tapping the corner of the papers with his pen. Then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You were right to come to me," he said quietly. "These signatures, they're inconsistent, and not just slightly. Some are photocopied, others traced. This is textbook forgery." Michael's jaw tightened. "So what does that mean, legally?" Jenkins looked between us. "It means your HOA's charter, the very document that gives them authority to collect dues, fine residents, and enforce bylaws, is invalid. In fact, if this goes public, it's not just Rick's presidency at stake. The entire HOA could be dissolved." I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief, anger, fear. If we exposed this, it would prove everything Rick had done was built on a lie. But it would also make us targets. Rick had already proven he'd do anything to silence opposition. "Is it dangerous to confront him?" I asked. Jenkins's expression hardened. "Legally, he has no ground left to stand on. But corrupt men don't always play by the law. Be careful." Michael reached for my hand under the table. "We can handle it," he said quietly. Jenkins nodded, closing the folder. "Then you'd better prepare yourselves, because once this comes out, there's no going back." He paused, his tone shifting from cautious to coldly deliberate. "Sarah," he said, meeting my eyes, "you don't just live in this HOA. You own it." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. I sat there frozen, the truth settling deep in my bones. For the first time, I realized this fight wasn't about saving my home anymore. It was about reclaiming everything my father had built, and everything Rick had stolen. "Michael, get out here. Someone poured gas all over our driveway." The sharp smell hit me first, thick, chemical, unmistakable. It was just after midnight when I stepped outside to close the garage, barefoot, holding a flashlight. The beam caught a dark shimmer across the concrete, a puddle that spread like spilled ink. I crouched down, heart pounding, and the fumes hit so strong they burned my throat. Gasoline. Michael ran out, still half asleep, his voice rising in panic. "What the hell happened?" I pointed to the slick trail that led from the curb all the way up to the garage door. "Someone did this on purpose." My voice trembled, half from fear, half from fury. The night air was still, too still, as if holding its breath. I scanned the street, quiet homes, porch lights glowing faintly, blinds pulled shut, not a soul in sight. But somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone wanted me to see this. We called 911, and within minutes, the red and blue lights flashed against our house. Deputy Harris arrived, tall and calm, his flashlight sweeping over the ground. "You're lucky it didn't ignite," he muttered, crouching to inspect the liquid. "You said you've had trouble with your HOA." I nodded, explaining the harassment, the fake violations, the forged documents Jenkins had discovered. Harris scribbled notes, but his face stayed unreadable. When he stood, he looked around the dark cul-de-sac. No containers, no footprints, no tire marks. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He ordered the fire department to hose down the driveway, then took my statement before heading back to his cruiser. "We'll keep an eye on your place," he said, but his tone carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many of these stories end badly. After he left, Michael and I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Around 3 in the morning, I found an envelope shoved halfway under our front mat. No stamp. No name. Just one line typed on plain paper: "Drop the lawsuit or face consequences." I sat there on the stairs holding that note, the house silent except for the clock ticking in the hallway. The gasoline wasn't random. It was a message. A warning. By sunrise, exhaustion had settled in, but I refused to let fear control me. I went outside, filming the damage, documenting everything. The air still smelled faintly of gasoline, a reminder of how far Rick was willing to go to intimidate me. Later that morning, Ellen Ruiz came over. her face pale and anxious. "Sarah," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I didn't want to get involved, but last night, I saw someone out here." My stomach turned. "Who?" She hesitated. "Rick's assistant, the tall one, with the gray truck. He was parked down the street around midnight. I saw him walking this way, carrying something." I thanked her, promising to keep her name out of it. She nodded nervously. "Be careful. People like him don't stop until they get what they want." That afternoon I called Deputy Harris again and told him about Ellen's sighting. He promised to follow up, but I could tell from his tone that this was turning into something bigger than a neighborhood dispute. Legal nugget. Threats and harassment from HOA officials can qualify as criminal intimidation under state law. Document everything and never confront them alone. The next morning, as I poured coffee and tried to steady my hands, a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. Harris stepped out, holding an envelope. His expression was unreadable. "Morning, ma'am," he said, voice low. "I've got something for you." He handed me the papers. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Restraining order. Filed by Cypress Ridge, HOA, against Sarah Thompson." I stared at the words, speechless, the irony hitting me like a punch. They tried to scare me with gasoline, and when that didn't work, they turned the law against me. Harris exhaled slowly. "Looks like they're not just threatening you anymore," he said. "They're going to war." "Mrs. Thompson, are you seriously claiming you own the HOA?" Rick barked, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The sound carried through the small county courtroom like a slap, drawing a few murmurs from the audience benches. Rick Callahan sat across the aisle, his suit a little too crisp, his smirk a little too wide. A man certain that the system he'd twisted for years would bend for him again. I sat next to Attorney Jenkins, palms damp, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't just another HOA dispute. This was the day we challenged everything he'd built on lies. The clerk called the session to order. Rick's attorney, a sharp-faced man with a shiny tie, began by painting me as a disgruntled homeowner seeking revenge for her supposed rule violations. His tone dripped with false civility. "Your Honor," he said, "my client's authority stems from a charter legally filed and renewed. Mrs. Thompson's accusations are unfounded and, frankly, defamatory." Jenkins didn't flinch. When it was our turn, he stood, his voice calm and deliberate. "Your Honor, my client is not retaliating. She's protecting property that's been wrongfully claimed. The Cypress Ridge HOA is operating under a forged charter, and more importantly, on land still owned by the Thompson Development Trust." A ripple of reaction ran through the room. Even the judge leaned forward. Jenkins clicked his remote, and the projector displayed a scanned document across the courtroom wall. The heading read, "Deed Transfer, 1986, Thompson Development Holdings." He walked the court through every point methodically. Parcel numbers, trust references, and notarized signatures, each one matching the county archives. The HOA charter, filed years later, listed the same parcels, but without a single legal transfer record. Rick shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. "Your Honor," Jenkins continued, "these deeds were recorded decades before the HOA existed, and as property law makes clear, a deed recorded first in the chain of title supersedes any subsequent claim or administrative authority. The HOA's jurisdiction is void." Legal nugget. A property deed recorded before HOA formation overrides any later HOA charter or enforcement authority. Title law always trumps association paperwork. Rick's attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection! The HOA has operated under community consent for years." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor. Consent doesn't override ownership." I felt my heart race as Jenkins placed the final folder on the bench. The original deed with my father's signature. The same one I'd found late that night among his files. The judge took a long look at it. "John R. Thompson," he read aloud. "Builder of record." He looked up at me. "He was your father?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady but quiet. For a moment, silence filled the room. Even Rick seemed unsure of himself now. His smirk faltered, the mask slipping. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk thoughtfully. Then he spoke, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. Given the evidence presented, the verified deeds, the inconsistencies in the HOA charter, and the possible forgery under review, this court hereby halts all HOA enforcement actions and financial operations pending a full investigation. The room erupted in whispers. Rick stood, visibly flustered. You can't do that. This entire community. The judge cut him off sharply. Mr. Callahan, you will sit down or be held in contempt. He sat. I exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in weeks. For the first time, Rick wasn't the man in control. He looked at me, eyes cold, jaw clenched, and I met his glare without blinking. Then the judge turned to me again. His expression softened, but his words landed like thunder. Mrs. Thompson, he said, looking over his glasses, based on these records, you might not just be a homeowner. You might own every inch of this neighborhood. The courtroom went completely silent. Rick's face turned pale, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw it. Fear. He's finished, Ellen whispered as we watched the HOA board argue in public. The town hall was overflowing that night. Folding chairs packed shoulder to shoulder, neighbors leaning against the back wall, the air thick with tension and the hum of angry voices. For years people had feared Rick Callahan and his board, but that fear had cracked the moment the judge's ruling went public. The HOA's operations were frozen, its authority questioned, and for the first time, Rick wasn't the one in control. From the front of the room, he tried to restore order. "Everyone calm down," he shouted, his voice cracking just slightly under the noise. But no one was listening anymore. A board member named Janet stood up, slamming her binder onto the table. "Don't tell us to calm down, Rick. You said the documents were legitimate. You said the charter was airtight." Rick's jaw tightened. "It is. This is just temporary." "Temporary?" Another man shouted from the crowd. "You've been stealing from us for years." The room erupted again. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping the floor. People waved copies of their violation letters and fine notices in the air, demanding answers. One woman shouted about being fined $800 for leaving her trash cans out for too long. Another man said Rick's board charged him for mandatory maintenance on a park that hadn't been touched in years. Ellen leaned close to me. "They're eating him alive," she said quietly. I didn't speak. I just watched as the board began turning on each other, desperate to save themselves. Janet pulled out a folder and tossed it across the table. "These emails," she snapped, "prove you moved money from the community maintenance fund into your personal account." A hush fell over the room. Rick froze, his face drained of color. "What emails?" a resident demanded. She turned toward the crowd. "Copies of every transaction." He was siphoning HOA dues into a consulting firm that doesn't exist. Gasps rippled through the hall. Someone in the back shouted, "Call the police!" Rick slammed his hands down. "Those are private records. You have no right." Janet cut him off. "You forged documents, Rick. You lied to us, to the homeowners, and now to a court." The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Half the board members stood and walked out. A few shouted at Rick to resign. Others demanded an emergency election. He yelled after them, but no one cared anymore. The king of Cypress Ridge had finally lost his crown. Over the next few days, the story exploded. Copies of those leaked emails made their way to local news stations. Channel 4 ran a headline that read, "HOA President Under Investigation for Fraud." The news anchor's voice was calm but damning. Financial documents suggest that thousands of dollars in homeowner dues were redirected to personal accounts. The phones in our neighborhood never stopped ringing. Residents demanded refunds for illegal fines, questioning every rule the HOA had ever enforced. Some even filed their own complaints with the state attorney's office. Legal nugget: misappropriation of HOA funds or using community dues for personal gain is grounds for criminal prosecution under state homeowner association laws. Everywhere I went, people stopped me. Not with hostility anymore, but with gratitude. You were right, Sarah. One man told me at the grocery store. We should have listened sooner. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The damage Rick caused went beyond money. It had divided an entire community. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table sorting through more documents for Attorney Jenkins, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson, a woman's voice said. This is Laura Daniels from Channel 4 News. I hesitated. Yes? We're digging into the Thompson Development Trust, she continued. Our records show something unusual. Your family trust doesn't just own your property. She paused, her tone shifting, almost reverent. It still holds the master deed to the entire subdivision. I froze, gripping the phone tighter as the weight of her words sank in. For the first time, I realized the truth was even bigger than Rick's fraud. He hadn't just stolen from homeowners. He'd built his empire on land that was never his to begin with. Breaking news. Homeowner discovers she owns the neighborhood her HOA tried to evict her from. The anchor's voice echoed from the television in my living room. Calm, but charged with the kind of disbelief that turns local news into a national headline. My face flashed briefly on screen, a still shot from the courthouse steps, papers in hand, the caption below reading, Cypress Ridge HOA under investigation for fraud and forgery. Overnight, my private battle had become public spectacle. Reporters crowded the sidewalks. Satellite vans lined the street where neighbors once whispered behind closed curtains. What started as an eviction notice was now the top story in 3 states. Every outlet wanted a quote. Every camera wanted a shot of the woman who'd brought down an entire HOA. Rick Callahan, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. When Channel 7's investigative team released their findings, it was worse than anyone expected. Over $300,000 in HOA dues were unaccounted for. Bank transfers led directly to a personal account under Rick's name, one he'd tried to disguise through a fake maintenance subcontractor. Investigators revealed falsified invoices for landscaping services and security upgrades that never existed. The next morning, the city paper's front page carried a single, brutal headline. HOA president vanishes as fraud investigation deepens. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now came knocking on my door. Some brought flowers. Others brought apologies. We didn't know, they said again and again. We thought you were just causing trouble. Ellen Ruiz hugged me so tightly I almost couldn't breathe. You did what no one else could, she whispered. You stood up to him. But truthfully, I hadn't done it alone. I'd just refused to back down when everyone else was too afraid to question the system. Seeing the relief on people's faces, people who'd lived under years of threats and manipulation, made the sleepless nights worth it. The community began to heal. The board was dissolved by emergency vote, and the homeowners gathered to discuss rebuilding without corruption. Attorney Jenkins explained our next legal step: finalizing the dissolution of the HOA entirely. Legal nugget. Under most state HOA laws, residents can dissolve a corrupt or inactive association by majority vote if legal control or trust ownership supersedes its charter. That night, local TV crews interviewed homeowners outside the neighborhood entrance. The sign that once read Cypress Ridge HOA, private property, had been covered with tape. Someone had written over it in bold marker, community owned and free. I stood on my porch watching the flashing lights from the news vans, my father's old deed folder clutched in my hands. It was surreal. This quiet street, once ruled by fear, now buzzing with hope. Then my phone rang. The caller ID read Jenkins Law Office. I answered, my pulse quickening. Hey, what's going on? Attorney Jenkins's voice was steady, but there was a hint of satisfaction behind it. Sarah, you might want to turn on the news again. It's already on, I said. Why? He exhaled slowly. Because they just confirmed it. Rick's been arrested. Embezzlement, forgery, fraud. The whole list. For a moment, I didn't speak. The sound of the TV in the background shifted to breaking coverage. Police cars, flashing lights, Rick in handcuffs being led down the courthouse steps. Jenkins continued quietly. "It's over, Sarah. You won." I sank into the couch, staring at the screen, not in triumph, but in quiet disbelief. After months of fear, humiliation, and fighting, justice had finally arrived. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because when power collapses, the question isn't who lost it, it's who's going to rebuild what comes next. "Rick Callahan," the judge thundered, "you are hereby sentenced for fraud and abuse of power." The words echoed off the paneled walls like a gavel striking bone. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras waiting for that one decisive moment. The air was tense, charged with the weight of months of chaos, fear, and truth finally dragged into the light. Rick sat at the defendant's table, pale and hollow-eyed. Gone was the smug smile, the expensive suit, the easy arrogance. He looked smaller now, like a man who'd been caught in his own trap. The judge's voice carried over the murmurs. "This court finds you guilty of forgery, misappropriation of funds, and unlawful use of authority under the Cypress Ridge Homeowners Association." Rick didn't look at anyone. His hands clenched the table's edge, knuckles white. Attorney Jenkins sat beside me, calm as ever. He'd fought this case methodically, letting the evidence speak louder than any accusation. Forged documents, false signatures, missing money, altered land records. Each piece had been another nail in Rick's coffin. When the judge lifted the stack of papers, the same deeds I'd once found buried in my father's boxes, I felt a lump rise in my throat. These documents confirm that ownership of all undeveloped and common areas within the Cypress Ridge subdivision remains under the Thompson Development Trust, the judge said. Therefore, the HOA's authority is hereby declared void and terminated. The gavel struck once. The sound hit me like a shockwave. It was over. Rick's attorney tried to protest, but the judge silenced him with a glare. "Mr. Callahan is ordered to repay all misappropriated funds and cover the legal fees incurred by the homeowners. Furthermore, his actions will be referred to the district attorney for criminal sentencing." Reporters erupted into a frenzy of whispered notes and rapid camera clicks. The bailiff moved toward Rick, who finally looked up, eyes filled with a mix of hatred and disbelief. For months he'd terrorized this community, weaponized fear, and twisted the law. Now, the law had turned on him. As the judge adjourned the hearing, I stood slowly, my knees unsteady. I turned to see faces, neighbors who'd once avoided me now nodding in silent gratitude. Ellen smiled from the back row, tears glinting in her eyes. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was blinding. Microphones flashed in my face as reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to win? What are your plans now? Will you rebuild the HOA?" I paused on the courthouse steps, clutching the same worn binder that held my father's deeds. For the first time in months, I felt still. I looked at the sea of cameras and spoke clearly, my voice steady despite the noise. "This was never about power," I said. "It was about justice, about protecting what my father built, and what this community deserves." The crowd fell quiet for a moment. Then came applause. Hesitant at first, then building. But through the noise I caught a glimpse of something else. One of Rick's former board members slipping quietly into a car across the street. Phone pressed to his ear. I didn't move. I just watched. Because even in victory, I could feel it. Something unfinished. Something waiting. As the cameras turned off and the reporters drifted away, I looked toward one lens still fixed on me. My reflection stared back from its dark glass. "I'm not done yet," I said quietly. And I meant every word. No more HOA, no more fear. We start fresh. Today. The words came out of my mouth before I'd even realized I was saying them. They weren't rehearsed or planned, just raw truth echoing across the community park, where a crowd of neighbors stood in a semicircle listening. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid me were now here, waiting for me to lead. It had been 3 weeks since the court verdict. Rick was behind bars, The HOA charter was officially dissolved, and Cypress Ridge, for the first time in decades, was free from control. But freedom without direction is chaos, and I refused to let my father's creation rot under the ruins of corruption. So I decided to rebuild. Not another HOA, not another regime of fear and fines, but a community, a voluntary neighborhood association, open to everyone, ruled not by power, but by participation. No dues, no threats, no secret meetings, just fairness, transparency, and shared responsibility. The first meeting took place right there in the park. The same one Rick used to lock up unless homeowners paid an access maintenance fee. The chains were gone now. Kids played on the swings again. Ellen brought lemonade and folding chairs. Michael helped hang a white banner across the gazebo that read, "Cypress Ridge Community Gathering. All welcome." I stood on the gazebo steps, clutching a clipboard filled with ideas and budgets. "We're starting simple," I said. "Park restoration, sidewalk repairs, repainting fences. Every dollar donated will be logged publicly. Every project voted on by residents." People nodded. A few clapped. Some smiled for the first time in months. That weekend, we painted fences, cleared overgrown lots, and fixed benches that had splintered under years of neglect. The sound of drills replaced the echo of arguments. The smell of fresh paint mixed with cut grass. For the first time in years, Cypress Ridge felt alive again. One by one, the people who doubted me came forward. Mr. Daniels from 3 houses down, who once accused me of ruining the neighborhood, brought over a tray of iced tea. "Didn't think you'd actually pull this off," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Guess I was wrong." Ellen laughed softly. "You've been wrong a lot lately, Tom," she teased, and for a moment, we all did something that had been missing here for far too long. We laughed together. Attorney Jenkins stopped by later that afternoon, sleeves rolled up, looking uncharacteristically relaxed. "You've managed what even the court couldn't," he said. "You turned division into unity." I smiled. "This isn't about me. It's about restoring what Rick tried to destroy." He nodded, glancing around the freshly mowed park. "Your father would be proud." Those words hit deeper than I expected. As the sun began to set, I walked to the far edge of the park, where an old oak tree still stood. One my father had planted when the first homes were built. Its roots ran deep, the same way his legacy had. I ran my fingers along the bark, and for the first time, I felt peace instead of pain. In that moment, I could almost hear him again, that steady voice from my childhood. "Always protect what carries your name, Sarah." I whispered back, "I am, Dad. I am." Over the next few weeks, things transformed faster than I could have imagined. The park reopened fully, driveways were repaired, and the community's old newsletter, once Rick's propaganda sheet, became a weekly bulletin of volunteer projects and neighborhood updates. People were talking again, helping each other again. We even hosted a Saturday potluck that drew nearly every resident on the block. Standing there, watching kids chase each other through sprinklers and neighbors chatting without suspicion, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about property. It was about trust. The nightmare was over. The fear was gone. And for the first time, Cypress Ridge truly belonged to the people who lived there. That night, when Michael and I finally sat down on the porch with mugs of coffee, a soft breeze carried the scent of cut grass and new beginnings. Everything felt right. Calm, earned, deserved. Then, as I reached for the stack of mail beside me, one envelope caught my eye. No return address, sealed with a wax emblem I hadn't seen in years. I turned it over, my heart tightening when I read the handwritten label across the front. Phase 2 Development Plan for Sarah. The world around me seemed to pause. Michael looked up from his cup. "What is it?" I stared at the envelope, running my thumb along its edge. "I don't know," I whispered. "But something tells me this story isn't over yet." "You didn't just save your home," Jenkins said. "You saved a legacy." His words echoed in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter I'd found the night before. The one marked Phase 2 Development Plan. For Sarah. The envelope was heavy, the paper aged but perfectly preserved. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the contents. Inside was a blueprint, my father's unmistakable drafting style, every line drawn with precision and pride. At the top, in his handwriting, were the words, Thompson Community Expansion Project. Beneath it, parcel numbers stretched across land I didn't recognize. I grabbed my laptop, cross-referencing them through the county database. My breath caught as the results appeared. The parcels weren't part of Cypress Ridge. They were beyond it, acres of undeveloped property sitting quietly under the same trust my father had left me. Land he'd purchased decades ago, meant for something bigger. I sat back, letting the realization wash over me. My father hadn't just built a neighborhood. He'd built a foundation, a blueprint for a future that someone was meant to finish. And somehow, through every lie, threat, and court battle, that someone had become me. When I showed Jenkins the next morning, he studied the plans in silence. He wanted to build parks, community centers, maybe even affordable homes, he said, tracing a finger along the map. Your father wasn't just a developer. He was a visionary. I nodded, emotions swelling in my throat. He always said land should serve people, not power. Jenkins looked up, smiling faintly. And now it's your turn to prove him right. Over the following weeks, I began taking steps to fulfill that plan. I met with architects, county officials, and community members. Together, we sketched out the beginnings of something my father would have been proud of. A development built on transparency and trust, not greed. The first project, an open park and memorial garden, dedicated to the people who fought back when it mattered most. The same people Rick had tried to silence were now helping design the future. Ellen volunteered to lead the landscaping team. Michael handled outreach. Even former critics offered their time and skills, eager to see something good rise from what had nearly destroyed us all. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of my father's dream coming back to life. Not through money or control, but through integrity. The streets of Cypress Ridge, once marked with red X's of defiance, now shimmered with new paint, bright flowers, and laughter. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air again, but this time, it wasn't construction driven by greed. It was creation born from healing. I stood at the edge of the property line one evening as the sun set, golden light spilling over the rooftops. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and cedar, the same scent that used to cling to my father's jacket. I could almost feel him beside me, proud, silent, at peace. That's when I understood the truth. I hadn't just fought an HOA. I had restored a vision, one built on fairness, honesty, and legacy. Moral, power without integrity always collapses. But truth never does. As the camera fades, my voice carries over the final image. If an HOA ever tried to evict you, would you fight back? Share your story below. The screen lingers on one last shot. Me walking down the quiet, rebuilt street as the camera pans upward to the new sign gleaming. In the dusk light, Thompson Estates, founded on integrity. And for the first time since it all began, I finally knew. My father's legacy was alive, and it was home.